That gentleman over there in the blue shirt, please. And there's a gentleman in a white shirt down here who'll be next. Yes, please.
Hi. I feel like there's been something very omitted from your general conversation and in general around the surprise or kind of reaction to the fact that these kind of politics are prevailing in our present and why? I mean, we kind of have that ready-made answer. We know that over the past decades, I mean, we can time scale it differently, that the left has been in decline in this country, globally, in general. The two parties in power don't offer contrasting programs. They don't offer different rights. They really don't. I mean, they're all part of a bureaucratic nanny state that's been, increasingly developing means of control to keep productive population, relatively happy in a period of capitalist crisis that has been going on basically, since the socialist uprisings of the early 20th century. So I feel like, why is that not being discussed? Why is the absence of politics that are allowing for this, as if it's a matter of the left, as if the left is somehow real in the present? Because I'm a leftist and I'm a member of a socialist party and a member of a study group, kind of lots of things I've done over the past decade as a leftist, but I also acknowledge that I'm in no position of power. You say you have a lot of power because you're on the microphone. I have the microphone right now. I don't feel empowered. As a leftist, I feel disempowered relative to the social situation that we're part of. So I just feel like you guys need to comment on that, the decline of the left.
Good point, well made. Gentleman here, and then who on this side wants to speak? There's someone in the middle there in a grey shirt, and we'll go to you first. Yep.
So I think the kind of pace of indignation at the moment is blistering, and it's really hard to kind of keep up with it. But I also think it's really corrosive. And I'm interested in whether or not you think a model established by Shelby Steele in White Guilt is relevant. So if you think of an oppressing group, acknowledges the sins of the past, that creates a loss of moral authority, and then there's this power dynamic between the oppressors and the oppressed, and there's stigma that goes with it, and I think, Brett, you kind of alluded to this a little. I wonder if you think that model is true, because I sort of thought it was true until I looked at the kind of Weinstein Sexminster scandal, because there I think there is a kind of loss of male authority which sets this thing up, with of course the exception that actually this loss of male authority is largely an invention and kind of hysterical. So I wonder if the left has gone from being aligned to historic causes that had substance to really being nothing but hysteria these days.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman, just there, and then we'll go to that lady there, and then we'll come back. Yep.
I heard an idea today that I hadn't thought about much, which was that the right hates ideas and philosophies, and the left hates people. And when people talk about Richard Spencer, they don't seem to hate his ideas as much as they hate him. And it seems that kind of animus seems to bind the farthest of the right and the left. And I just want to hear if you have an idea about that.
Thank you very much. And just down here. Yep.
Thank you. I just, by the way, want to thank you for coming to the United States and for doing this tour of yours. And especially, and I've been following Spiked Online for a long time now, and I've been following especially what you've been through, Brett, since it broke, the news broke. One of the things that seems to me that, well, there are two things that's not being talked about. We're talking as if the only fascist threat is on the right. And nobody is really confronting the reality that, and I think Brett brought it up in terms of the authoritarian-libertarian divide, that on the left we're getting as much of an authoritarian push as anything we've ever seen on the right. And the other point, which is included here, is that I'm hearing you talk about generalities regarding, free expression, free speech. But my background, I happen to be the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And I've made it into my dotage, having to really be aware of everything going on around me. And I'll tell you the truth that I'm much more concerned with the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic activities on the far left than I am from these I've been aware of the right since I was old enough. Mm-hmm. And, I don't see them as this huge threat so much as the overreaction and the anger that feeds into the mainstream America watching this on the media, wondering who's off control now. So I just wanted to bring that one up.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to come back to the panel now, who I'm going to ask to be as brief as they possibly can, because I want to try and go out and get a handful more before we come back. So Laura, have you got anything you want to respond to? There is a lot there. Is the left dead? That was my favourite question from over there, so shoot.
Well, I'm trying to sort through all this myself, obviously. I'm kind of surprised to hear you say, the last person who spoke, that you're more worried about the left when, the right and, the Republican Party, as I say, has, stripped African Americans of voting rights, occupy all the state houses, have taken over the Supreme Court, the White House, all and are executing policy.
No, actually, just in the spirit of moving on swiftly.
So,
let's.
There are just these. There's a reality to these political shifts that I guess I actually am more worried about, and am responding to. So it doesn't seem to me that like inviting Richard Spencer to campus. The conversation we have been having, I think, divides between whether the free speech issue is like idea neutral, and we have to support the free speech as a principle, or whether the ideas that are being promoted have efficacy and matter and affect people's lives, particularly on campus, because I'm talking about the campus situation, and how what's said. If we allow white supremacists on campus to organize on campus, we are effectively saying it's okay to create exclusions for other populations, and I think that is opposed to what the mission, what we're supposed to be about in higher education. And so these things, I think, are very worrisome. I take them seriously at a content level as opposed to, and I guess that was the distinction I was drawing between the principles. That there are specific things happening that we have to deal with as opposed to, the principle about it. So that's
Thank you,
as
Laura.
much as I can come up with right now.
Definitely. And Brendan, your thoughts, please.
But what you're describing is licensed speech. It's not freedom of speech. And I think it's really important that we recognize that. I think I agree with the speaker here who said that the overreaction to the right is now more dangerous than the right. I'm opposed to Trump. I'm against pretty much everything he's done so far and everything he's said. But Trump derangement syndrome strikes me as a far greater threat to the idea of democracy, to the idea of open debate, to the idea of campus debate than Trump himself is. I think the reaction is incredibly dangerous. And it's interesting that you mentioned being the daughter of Holocaust survivors. I was at the Museum of the History of the Jews of Poland in Warsaw a few weeks ago, and what was really striking, what you really got from visiting that museum, is that fascism is censorship. And anti-fascism is freedom of speech, because what it had in that museum was all these pamphlets and magazines that people produced in the Warsaw Ghetto for which they could be shot on the spot. So they had to hide them, they had to print them in bunkers, they had to distribute them in the dead of night because they were censored by the Nazis from expressing themselves. Nazism is censorship. That's what it is. Anti-fascism is freedom of speech. If you are attacking freedom of speech, you are not an anti-fascist. That is the bottom line of this discussion. You are far more like the other guys. You are far more like the guys who threatened to kill Warsaw Ghetto Jews for publishing pamphlets. Final point I want to make on the heckling question. I think the heckling question is very simple. One of the greatest things ever written about freedom of speech was written in response to the heckling question. It was a plea for free speech by Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, who wrote this piece after a meeting of abolitionists in Boston was interrupted by racists and pro-slavery people and shouted down. And he wrote A Plea for Free Speech, which is one of the best and most passionate things you will ever read in defense of freedom of speech. So that wasn't a First Amendment issue. The state, Congress, government was not interfering with his and the other people's rights. That was a matter of informal censorship enforced by a mob, or as we would now call them, a protest of SJWs. So this question of informal censorship has been around for a long time, and if you want to know when heckling becomes a problem, i.e. when someone is prevented from speaking, read Frederick Douglass, read the minority groups who struggled for freedom of speech for decades, who you now demean through saying, oh, free speech doesn't matter. That's the shocking thing. Heroes of mine had their ears cut off, their tongues pulled out, they were tied to the stocks, they were pelted with eggs, they were jailed for years for expressing their freedom of speech. The idea that you would now turn against the idea of freedom of speech is a grave insult to history and to the people who made our lives as nice as they currently are.
But do you know that, can I just say one thing?
Quickly, if you will.
All speech on campus is licensed speech. Only certain people get to speak. Only certain students get in on the basis of their ideas. Certain people are allowed to teach, on the basis of being judged adequate to speak. We don't let people, like in class, say fuck you to their professor. It is already, there are speech codes and civility codes in place, so it is licensed speech. That is the bottom line.
No, but the problem is if groups of students want to invite someone because they're interested in his ideas and they want to hear from him, and there is a rule or a policy code or another group of students who prevent them from doing so, that's where it explicitly becomes a freedom of speech question. People are being prevented from engaging in discussion with someone they find interesting.
I think we're going to leave that there and move on to Angus. So anything in response to what you've heard from
well, yeah,
the
so
audience or the panel?
I think that one of the things that I very much agree with that you just said is that the core free speech rights, if there is a disruption in that way, is of the students who invited the speaker, right? Because they are the people who have standing to make the invitation, and they are the ones who are most being interfered with. And I think that we really do need to pay a lot more attention to the free speech rights and the freedom of expression rights of students on the campuses. I think about the Irvine 11 a few years ago, where students who were essentially heckling the Israeli ambassador were arrested and charged with crimes for engaging in protest speech. I'm thinking about the fact that at UC Berkeley, at around the same time, dozens and dozens of students who were peacefully protesting inside an administration building were woken from their sleep and arrested and then taken all the way 2 counties away so that it would take the entire day to process them, so that they, without actually charging them with a crime, they could be taken out of action and not able to join the protest that was scheduled to happen on campus the next day, right? I'm talking about all the students who have been beaten by campus cops, the vast majority of them leftists in the last few years. And I think that the silence of most civil libertarians on all of those issues has really been profound. And if we are concerned that today's generation of student activists do not see free speech as a central right, I would say one of the questions that we need to look at is, when have we shown them as civil libertarians that the right of free speech is one that extends to them and extends to them even when they're being a bit rowdy, and that we are going to stand up and defend them? If all they see is us standing up for Nazis, they're not going to believe that free speech is a real living thing in this country today.
Thank you, Angus. Hold up. And Brett.
So I want to pick up this question about the state of the left at the moment, which I find fascinating in the following sense. Most popular politician in the country today, by far, is Bernie Sanders. That is an amazing statement of fact. It is a heck of a time for the left to be attacking itself in the way that it is doing it. Finally, people are actually listening to a person with integrity who really is on the left, who has important things to say. Why is the left so dysfunctional? And I would submit that there are a couple of things in play here. One of them is that we have a fundamental defect in our political apparatus, and that is a positive feedback, where if you generate wealth, it doesn't matter how you've generated it, it buys you political power, and if you have political power, you can restructure the system so you generate more wealth. That positive feedback system is effectively evolutionary, and it has resulted in the capture of the entire apparatus by people who don't agree on much, except that they do not want change built around redistribution. So we have, and I don't want to call it a conspiracy because it doesn't even have to be conscious. What we have is the evolution of something that effectively forbids redistribution. And what that means is that the left has been out of power for a very long time. And having been out of power for so long, it has lost touch with what it is supposed to be doing, what it is supposed to be advocating, how it is supposed to collaborate, all of those things. So one thing that we have to recognize is that we're effectively, I mean, how many times as things fell apart at Evergreen did it strike me that this is little more than a temper tantrum? This is a temper tantrum that is wielding real power, and that's a frightening thing. So in order to fix this discussion, I would suggest that the left needs to, A, recognize that it needs to regenerate the tools of how to wield power properly and effectively. It has to think carefully and consciously about that question. And it should probably think about revising what it is interested in redistributing. And the reason for that is if we have a discussion about redistributing wealth, we immediately lose everybody on the libertarian right. They are not interested in having that discussion. On the other hand, if you have a discussion about redistributing opportunity so that it is equally distributed across society, the libertarian right is suddenly listening, because a truly ideological libertarian will agree that the system functions better when everybody has opportunity to access the market, to innovate, and to provide superior ideas that can then catch on. So if we want unity that actually allows the wielding of power, we should rethink what it is that we are advocating.
Thank you, Brett. So, we've got about 5 minutes left and nowhere near enough time, but I'm going to try and take as many of you as possible before we bring it back to the panel. So there's a lady at the back there who's had their hand up for a little while, and then we'll also take this gentleman down here for now. So brief, if you will, so we can...
Very brief. Brendan mentioned generational differences, and Laura was talking about what would be the appropriate role for professors in trying to balance students' reaction to their personal experiences versus what they learn academically. And Brett was talking about bad actors. Having seen some of his videos, I know some of those were not just students. They were amongst the establishment in the administration and the faculty. So if you could speak to a little bit about what the grown-ups in the room are doing or should be doing, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Gentleman here, and then there's a guy who's really going for it at the back there. Give him the mic, and then you first.
This question's for Brett. I was wondering if there were any evolutionary or biochemical explanations for all of the hardline rigidness that we're seeing with sort of these political outlooks that have become more extreme and fanatic.
Thank you. You, any hands over here while we're here? Yeah, there's a gentleman just back there. So you first, and then we'll go there.
Okay. Hi. I was going to ask a question about how can we raise awareness to the issues we will be talking about tonight. However, there are some apologists in the room, I can tell. Laura, specifically. As an evil white man, how are you going to talk me down?
Not being liked, it's okay.
How are you going to talk me down from the tower of telling you that progressivism is a failed ideology? You have this system called the progressive stack in which there are oppressed and there are not oppressed. And just this week, we had this sign being plastered around campuses across the country saying, it's okay to be white, and that was considered racist. So I would like to tell you, or ask you, how do you think progressivism is not a failed ideology?
Okay, quickly, so we'll take this gentleman, and then I'm going to come to some here because I've been ignoring you, and then we'll come back. So,
which one?
I thought we already had one. Oh, come down the front here because we've got a clutch of people who I've been ignoring because they were out of my line of sight. So I'm going to take these three here, but you've got to be really, really quick, and then we're going to come back.
Hi, thank you. So one thing I heard from Brendan strongly, and to a lesser extent from Brett, was that you believe that there is a coherent, organized movement out there of people who have values and priorities antithetical to your own. And the prescription for that is to fight them and not ally with them. What I heard, certainly, what I believe I heard from Laura and Angus, is that there are a group of people out there who share your values and priorities, but are misguided and miseducated. which is a very different thing. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you very much. And then just you two in that row there, and then we'll have to come back, I'm afraid.
This is for Laura and Brett. I was student government president at a small college called Middlebury. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. During a complicated time, and as sort of a young person trying to think about these issues, it was very challenging to find room for nuance and negative capability. That phrase really struck me when you described it. And Brett, you mentioned social penalty. And I'm wondering, how are young people supposed to work through these very complicated issues while facing the potential for social penalty?
Thank you. And yeah.
On campus, has the educated and conscientious conservative become an inconvenient truth? I'm referring here to the glaring lack of viewpoint diversity at leading universities, and I'm speaking as someone who has literally been called a fascist for saying I believe in objective standards in art.
Thank you very much. Right. Thank you all for your questions. Sorry I didn't get everyone in, but time is short. So, panel, I'm going to ask you to take about a minute or so you can either respond to anything you've heard or completely ignore them and just give us your final thoughts. So let's go the opposite direction now. So, Brett, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I was struck by the question of what are the adults in the room saying, and I would say I don't like hearing myself say this, but increasingly I think most rooms don't have any adults in them, and that's part of the problem. And that sounds tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure, but really what I mean is that the developmental process that results in truly adult levels of nuance, those processes are broken, and this is going to make them worse. If we make universities into places that are antagonistic to inquiry, then either inquiry is going to move somewhere else and it's going to have to build the university system anew, or we're in serious trouble as a civilization because that nuance is simply necessary to navigating.
Thank you, Brett. Angus.
I'd like to respond to what you said about this. Are some folks misguided? And I think that there is stuff that some people need to learn, and I think there is more room for compromise. There is more room for finding community with folks at various different places on the left than a lot of the people in this room see. I've spoken to a lot of these folks one-on-one, and there's a lot more common ground than is often visible in the media. And the other thing that I would say is, particularly in terms of campus activists, we're not supposed to like what they're doing, right? That's kind of the whole thing, that they're supposed to be pushing boundaries, they're supposed to be going farther. And one of the reasons why I am way more scared of the right than I am of the left is that Donald Trump is president, and the folks who are causing the most trouble on campus have very, very little power. Now, you may think they have more power than they should, but we are in a position where the amount of power that is wielded by the people that I don't like on the left is way, way less than the amount that is wielded by the people that I don't like on the right. And I really do believe that there is an immense possibility for real communication and coming together, particularly when you're talking to people one-on-one or in small groups. And I would encourage everybody in this room to seek out those opportunities, because that's where the real change happens, I think.
Thank you, Angus. And Laura, your final thoughts, please.
One of the ways that I got into trouble on my own campus was by trying to complicate issues that people didn't want to see as complicated and trying to interject nuance into some of the discussions. This was around sexual politics and rape culture and that sort of thing. And I became, the subject of a lot of opprobrium and Title IX complaints. So I feel a little bit like I'm, as I said, tried to be funny to the guy who was accusing me of something or another from the back of the room. Yeah, I'm used to being in a room full of people who don't like me, because I guess I'm, finding myself dissatisfied with taking the easy position. And I guess when I've used the word principle to you, it's because, I would love to take the absolutist position, because then I get the applause and people would say, yeah, and it sounds good and it's comforting to be able to draw these hard lines about complicated issues. but it started to seem inadequate to me. And that's what I actually am trying to sort my way through, that the responses that I fell easily into didn't seem adequate to the current political situation and to my own experiences as a teacher on campus and seeing students having to confront these sort of issues like white supremacists coming to campus and that sort of thing. So it's lived experience. And I'm not, claiming experience is some special privileged position, but I'm saying it has to factor into the kind of analysis that we make about the present moment.
Thank you, Laura. And Brendan.
Yeah, I would just say in response to that, free speech is the facilitator of intellectual confusion and doubt and skepticism and debate and conflict and tension. So it's a very, very, very simple idea, which is that no one should ever be censored, but it gives rise to precisely the kind of culture I think that you want and which I think we all want. The question of where are the grown-ups, that's the question, I think, to ask. And that's what I was getting at earlier on, which is that I don't think this is just gangs of radical left students attacking more moderate left students and so on and so forth. It's something more profound than that. It's the playing out of a long-term generational loss of faith by Western society in its own founding values. And when you raise a whole new generation with no respect for due process, no respect for freedom of speech, to cultivate their own self-esteem and protect their own self-esteem above all else, you make monsters. So it's not entirely their fault. The final point I would end on is in relation to freedom of speech. Angus says, okay, if a group of students is denied the right to invite a speaker, then those students' speech rights are undermined, but not necessarily the speakers. Those speech rights, the speech rights of listening to speech, are the most important rights in freedom of speech. Because it's only by having the right to hear everything and judging for yourself if it's a good idea or a bad idea that you can be a full-rounded, free member of society. Censorship tells you not to think for yourself. Censorship invites you to be a child. Censorship says, you don't have to hear this thing because we have decided on your behalf that it's not a good idea. Censorship is disempowering, insulting, paternalistic, and it encourages stupidity. I think the most important, it's very important that everyone has the right to say what they want. It's even more important that we all have the right to hear them and judge for ourselves using our free will and our autonomous thinking, whether they're talking sense or nonsense.
Thank you, Brendan. If we thank all of our panel. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be hanging around for a few minutes, so please do come say hello and talk about Spite. Thank you all for coming. Cheers.